The air in the boardroom was brittle, a physical weight pressing against my temples. Julianne stood at the head of the mahogany table, her posture rigid, cornered by the board regarding the missing compliance files. I could see the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes, a vulnerability she never showed the world. The stakes were absolute. Her legacy, her company, her life's work, all on the line. She opened her mouth to speak, her composure fracturing for the first time in years. I couldn't let it happen. I interrupted her, my voice steady. "It wasn't her," I said. "It was me." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room until my chest ached. The projector hummed, a low, indifferent drone that seemed deafening in the quiet. I felt the cold leather of the executive chair against my back, a stark contrast to the heat rising in my cheeks. Julianne turned to me, and for a heartbeat, the CEO mask slipped. Her eyes, usually so guarded and precise, were wide with a sharp, terrified confusion. It wasn't relief. It was horror. She looked at me as if I had just stepped off a ledge, her lips parting slightly in a silent protest that never came. I held her gaze, unflinching. "Stay quiet," I willed her. "Let me take this." I turned to the board, addressing the chairman directly. "The unauthorized transfer," I lied, forcing the words to sound clinical, "was a clerical error on my part. I hid the files to cover my negligence. Julianne had no knowledge of the oversight." The lie was specific, tailored to the minute details of our operations. I claimed I had bypassed the compliance software to expedite the subsidiary funding, a technical impossibility that I made sound like a lazy shortcut. I was shielding her desperate, unauthorized move to save the failing acquisition, taking the blame for the financial maneuvering she had orchestrated in the dark. By framing it as my incompetence, I turned a corporate crime into an administrative failure. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The sharks stopped circling the CEO and turned their dead eyes toward me. The aggression drained out of them, replaced by a dismissive irritation. They weren't angry anymore. They were just inconvenienced. The scent of stale espresso and cold fear hung in the air. I watched the faces of the men who held my future in their hands, men I had greeted every morning for 3 years, men whose coffees I had ordered, whose wives' birthdays I had reminded them of. Now, they looked at me with nothing but cold calculation. The chairman sat back, tapping his gold pen against his notebook. "Gross negligence," he muttered, looking at me as if I were a stain on the carpet. "That simplifies the investigation." I risked a glance at Julianne. She hadn't moved. Her hand was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. She wasn't breathing. I saw the war behind her eyes, the instinct to correct the record, fighting against the survival instinct I had just triggered. She knew what this meant. She knew I was torching my reputation, my license, my future, and she knew she had to let me burn. That was the deal we never made, but always understood. A strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of the executioner's block. I wasn't panicking. I felt a detached clarity, observing the destruction of my professional life with the same precision I used to organize her calendar. I watched the board members murmur amongst themselves, deciding my fate in hushed tones. They didn't ask for my side of the story. They didn't need to. I had given them a scapegoat, and they were eager to accept the offering. "We will need your resignation immediately," the chairman said, not even looking me in the eye. "And you understand this means you will be blacklisted from any future roles in this sector." "I understand," I said. The words were simple, but they felt heavy, like stones dropping into deep water. Julianne finally looked away. She stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection ghostly against the gray city skyline. She was safe. The company was surviving. But as the meeting adjourned and the directors began to pack their bags, the distance between us felt insurmountable. I stood up, my legs numb. I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't. The air between us was charged with the weight of the lie, a secret that now bound us together even as it tore my life apart. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, the sound of my own heartbeat louder than the footsteps fading behind me. I had saved her. Now came the fall. The walk from the boardroom to my desk was a distance of perhaps 50 feet, yet it felt like crossing a different kind of border. HR was already waiting for me. They stood by my cubicle with the grim efficiency of undertakers, a cardboard box unfolded and ready on the glass surface. It was a standard protocol: immediate removal, supervision, no access to the server. But the familiarity of the procedure didn't dull the sharp, metallic taste of humiliation that flooded my mouth. I had written this protocol. I had drafted the employee handbook that now dictated my own erasure. I stepped into my workspace, the sanctuary where I had spent 14 hours a day for the last 3 years. The air here felt different than the boardroom, still conditioned and cool, but charged with the static of 100 people pretending not to look. The silence on the floor was heavy, performative. Phones were being answered in hushed tones. Keyboards were tapped with tentative softness. I could feel their eyes on my back, a collective gaze of curiosity and relief that the axe had fallen on someone else. I reached for the first object, the fountain pen sitting on my blotter. It was black lacquer with gold trim, heavy and cool to the touch. Julianne had given it to me after the Tokyo merger closed. I remembered the moment with a clarity that stung. Late night in her office, the city grid glowing below us, the rare looseness in her shoulders as she handed me the velvet case. "For the woman who writes my reality," she had said, her voice low, stripping away the professional distance for just a second. I ran my thumb over the gold nib. Taking it felt like theft, but leaving it felt like an admission that the moment hadn't mattered. I dropped it into the box. It hit the bottom with a dull thud. Next was the framed photograph tucked behind my monitor. It wasn't a personal family photo. It was a candid shot from the company gala 2 years ago. In the frame, Julianne was laughing, a genuine head-thrown back laugh that the public never saw. And I was standing just behind her, holding her clutch and smiling at her joy. It was a picture of a servant and a queen, but to me, it was proof of the intimacy we shared in the margins of her schedule. I placed it face down in the box. I didn't need HR seeing the devotion in my eyes in that glossy print. The rest of the desk was cleared with mechanical precision. A spare charger, a tin of mints she liked, a leather notebook filled with her preferences, how she took her coffee, which flight routes she hated, the dates of her mother's medical appointments. I hesitated over the notebook. It was a map of her life. Leaving it behind felt like leaving her exposed. The HR representative cleared her throat, a sharp, impatient sound. "Company property, Miss Lane," she said, pointing to the notebook. I set it back down on the desk. The loss of that book hurt more than the loss of the salary. It was the surrender of my utility. I stood up, the box light in my arms but heavy in my chest. I turned toward the corner office, Julianne's office. The blinds were drawn, but the lights were still on inside. Through the frosted glass, I could see her silhouette. She was standing by the door, motionless. She wasn't working. She wasn't on the phone. She was just standing there, inches from the glass, facing me. I paused. The air between us, separated by that layer of frosted privacy, thickened. I wanted her to open the door. I wanted her to break the protocol, to step out and acknowledge the sacrifice, to offer even a single nod of validation. But the silhouette remained still, a statue of resolve. She was protecting the lie. If she came out, if she showed emotion, the board would smell blood. She was doing exactly what a CEO had to do, and I hated her for it. I hated the discipline I had helped cultivate. I turned away, breaking the invisible line of tension that tethered us, and walked toward the elevators. The ride down was a physical shedding of skin. As the numbers on the display ticked downward, 40, 39, 38, I felt the pressure building in my ears. Each floor passing was a layer of status stripped away. By the time the doors slid open at the lobby, I wasn't the CEO's right hand anymore. I was just a woman with a box in a marble hallway. I walked past the security desk. The guard, a man I chatted with every morning, looked down at his monitors, unable to meet my gaze. I pushed through the revolving doors, and the city air hit me, humid, loud, and smelling of exhaust and rain. It was the smell of the real world, chaotic and unregulated. I stood on the pavement for a moment, the corporate fortress rising behind me, a glass needle stitching the clouds. I didn't look back. I hailed a cab, the box resting on my knees, and as the car pulled away into traffic, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the sudden, violent withdrawal of her presence. 3 weeks is exactly 504 hours. When you are running a Fortune 500 CEO's life, 500 hours is a lifetime. It's 3 international trips, 2 board meetings, a dozen crisis calls, and endless streams of data processed and filed. But when you are sitting in a silent apartment with the blinds drawn against the midday sun, 500 hours feels like a single, suffocating breath held for too long. The silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't peaceful. It was aggressive. For 3 years, my life had been a symphony of notifications, ringtones, and the constant low-level hum of high-stakes anxiety. I had lived on adrenaline and cortisol, my body tuned to the specific frequency of Julianne's needs. Now, the quiet in my living room was absolute. The refrigerator hummed. A car drove by outside. That was it. I would wake up at 4 a.m., my hand already reaching for a phone that held no new emails, my heart pounding with a panic that had nowhere to go. It was a phantom limb syndrome of the career. I was reaching for a crisis that wasn't there, grasping for a woman who no longer needed me. I spent the first week pacing. I reorganized my bookshelf by color, then by author, then by publication date. I scrubbed the grout in the bathroom until my knuckles were raw. I was trying to burn off the energy that used to fuel billion-dollar mergers, but domestic tasks are a poor substitute for corporate warfare. The withdrawal was physical. I missed the rush of solving the impossible. I missed the feeling of walking half a step behind her, knowing I was the reason she didn't stumble. Without her orbit, I had no gravity. I was just drifting in a beautifully decorated box in the city, untethered and irrelevant. Then came the media fallout. I avoided it for 2 days, then binged it all in one sick, masochistic afternoon. The articles were exactly what I had designed them to be: vague, sanitized, and boring. Administrative restructuring at Apex Corp. Compliance error cited in minor delay. They were masterpieces of public relations spin. There was no mention of the family trust, no whisper of the illegal conflict of interest, no hint of the desperate financial hole Julianne had been trying to fill. Just a nameless senior administrative assistant, dismissed for gross negligence. I saw a photo of her in the journal. She was leaving the headquarters, wearing the charcoal coat I had selected for her, flanked by security. She looked impeccable, unshakable. The headline discussed her decisive action in correcting internal errors. The lie had worked perfectly. I had built a fortress of blame around myself, and she was safe inside the castle. Seeing her look so untouched triggered a bitter cocktail of pride and resentment. I had saved her. I had done my job perfectly, right up to the moment I destroyed myself. And in return, I got silence. I didn't call her. God knows I wanted to. There were nights, usually around the time I knew she'd be leaving the office, where I would stare at her number until the screen blurred. I wanted to hear her voice, even if it was just to ask me where a file was. But I couldn't be the one to break. The power dynamic had always been clear. She commanded, I executed. If I called now, I would just be the disgraced ex-employee begging for a scrap of attention. I needed her to acknowledge the debt. I needed her to feel the absence of my mind in her life. So I let the phone stay dark. The courier arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, shattering the routine of my solitude. He wasn't a standard delivery guy. He was private dispatch, wearing a suit that cost more than my rent. He didn't ask for a signature. He just handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope and walked away without a word. I stood in the doorway, the heavy cardstock cool against my fingers. There was no return address, no company logo, just my name, handwritten in black ink. My breath hitched. I would know that handwriting anywhere. Sharp, angular, rushed but elegant. It was the script that had signed off on layoffs and acquisitions, the script that had approved my bonuses and my vacation days. I carried it to the kitchen table like it was a bomb. Inside, there was a single card. No letterhead, no explanation. Just an address in the Upper East Side and a time. Tonight, 9 p.m. No signature was necessary. The command was implicit. The silence was finally over, but as I looked at the address, a private residence, not the office, I realized the rules of engagement had shifted. This wasn't a summons to work. It was an invitation to something else entirely. The address led to a quiet, tree-lined street in the Upper East Side, a place where the city's roar was dampened into a respectful hush. The brownstone was imposing, a 4-story structure of gray limestone that seemed to swallow the streetlight before it could reach the windows. I paid the cab driver and stood on the pavement for a long moment, the engine fading into the distance, leaving me alone with the sound of my own uneven breathing. I had managed Julianne's life for 3 years. I knew her social security number, her blood type, and the code to her office safe. But I had never stood here. This was the one boundary she had drawn in permanent ink. Her home was a fortress, and I was standing at the gate without a key. I walked up the stone steps, the heels of my boots clicking sharply against the masonry. The door was heavy, solid oak with iron fixtures that felt cold and ancient under my hand. I pressed the bell. It didn't buzz. It chimed deep within the house, a singular, resonant note that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. I waited. My hands were empty. No notebook, no phone, no files. For the first time in our acquaintance, I had nothing to offer her but myself. The vulnerability of that realization made my skin prickle. I smoothed the front of my coat, a nervous tic I thought I had abandoned years ago. The door didn't click open electronically. There was no intercom, no housekeeper peering through a peephole. The heavy wood simply swung inward, pulled by a human hand. Julianne stood in the threshold. The sight of her stole the air from my lungs. I was accustomed to the Julianne of the boardroom, the armor of tailored Armani, the hair pulled back in a severe geometrical chignon, the face painted with a mask of impenetrable authority. The woman standing before me was a stranger. She wore a loose, charcoal cashmere sweater that hung off one shoulder and dark trousers that were soft, unstructured. Her feet were bare against the dark wood of the foyer. Her hair was down, a dark cascade that softened the sharp angles of her jaw, making her look younger and infinitely more tired. "Sophie," she said. Her voice was lower than I remembered, stripped of its usual projection. It wasn't a question, just an acknowledgement of my presence, heavy with a fatigue she hadn't let the board see. "You sent for me?" I said. My voice sounded thin in the open doorway. She stepped back, a silent invitation. "Come in." I crossed the threshold and the door closed behind me, sealing out the damp city air. The sensory shift was immediate and disorienting. The foyer smelled of cedar, old paper, and a faint, lingering trace of expensive red wine. It was a warm, rich scent, darker and more complex than the sterile ozone smell of the office. The lighting was dim, provided by sconces that cast long amber shadows against walls lined with art I recognized from insurance manifests, but had never seen in person. "Coat," she murmured, reaching out. I let her take my trench coat. The action was confusingly intimate. In our previous life, I would have been the one taking her coat, hanging it up, brushing the rain from the shoulders. Now, she held the fabric of my life in her hands, hanging it with a slow, deliberate care on the rack. The reversal of roles made me dizzy. I felt unmoored, drifting in a space where the cardinal directions of our relationship no longer applied. "This way," she said, turning away from me. I followed her down the hallway, the floorboards silent beneath our feet. We entered a library at the back of the house. It was a cavernous room, walls lined floor to ceiling with books that looked read, not just displayed. A fire burned low in the grate, not gas, but real wood, crackling softly in the silence. 2 velvet armchairs faced the hearth, separated by a low table holding a decanter and 2 glasses. She walked to the table and lifted the decanter. Her hand, usually so steady it could sign $1 million contracts without a tremor, shook slightly. The crystal clinked against the glass, a sharp sound that punctuated the thick atmosphere. She poured the wine, a deep, blood-red vintage, with a focus that felt like avoidance. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the liquid, watching it rise, measuring the seconds before she had to face the woman who had fallen on the grenade for her. I stood in the center of the room, feeling like an intruder in a sanctuary. This was where she went to be human. This was where the CEO died and the woman breathed. Being here felt more transgressive than the lie I had told the board. I had seen her financial records, her medical history, her emails. But seeing her barefoot, in her own home, pouring wine with a shaking hand, that was the nakedness I wasn't prepared for. She turned, extending a glass toward me. The firelight caught the amber in her eyes, revealing a depth of uncertainty I had never witnessed. "Drink," she surely said. "The 96. You ordered it for the cellar last year." I took the glass. Our fingers brushed, a fleeting electric contact that sent a jolt straight to my chest. The heat of her skin was shocking. "I remember," I said softly. We stood there, the wine untouched, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. The pleasantries of a boss and an employee were dead. The script we had followed for 3 years had been burned. What was left was just two women in a dim room, bound by a secret that had destroyed one life to save another. The air charged, heavy with the question she hadn't asked yet, the question that had brought me here. Julianne didn't sit. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her bare feet silent against the wool, moving with the restless energy of a caged animal. She held her wine glass like a weapon, the dark liquid swirling dangerously close to the rim with every sharp turn she made. I watched her from the center of the room, feeling the heat of the fire against my back, contrasted by the chill of her scrutiny. She stopped abruptly near the mantel, her back to me, staring into the dying embers as if they held the logic she was desperately searching for. Why? The word cracked through the room, sharp and demanding. It wasn't a question asked in curiosity. It was an interrogation. She spun around to face me, and the vulnerability I'd glimpsed in the foyer was gone, replaced by a frantic, terrified anger. "You didn't just resign, Sophie. You incinerated your career. You let them brand you incompetent. You let them strip you of a license you worked 10 years to earn. Why?" I took a slow sip of the wine. It was heavy, complex, with notes of dark fruit and earth. A vintage that required patience to understand, much like the woman standing before me. I didn't answer immediately. I let the question hang there, forcing her to sit in the discomfort of her own salvation. I walked over to the deep velvet sofa and sat down, placing my glass on the low table with a deliberate, soft click. I needed to ground myself. "Because you were going to break," I said finally, keeping my voice low and steady. "I saw your hands shaking under the table, Julianne. I saw the panic in your eyes when the chairman asked for the ledger. You built that company from the ground up. You are the architecture of that entire world. If you had admitted to the transfer, the board wouldn't have just fired you. They would have dismantled the legacy. They would have torn it down brick by brick just to find the rot." I looked up at her, locking eyes with an intensity that dared her to look away. I couldn't watch the building fall. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The logic was sound, clinical even, but we both knew it was incomplete. It wasn't just about the company. It was about the mornings where I handed her coffee and knew she hadn't slept. It was about the way she looked at the skyline when she thought she was alone. It was about the silent, terrifying understanding that I was the only person who saw the woman behind the title. She walked over to the sofa and sat on the opposite end. The distance between us, perhaps 3 feet of dark blue velvet, felt like a canyon, yet the air crackled across it. She set her glass down, her fingers lingering on the stem, trembling slightly. The anger drained out of her, leaving something far more dangerous in its wake. Raw, unfiltered honesty. "It was a mistake," she whispered, the admission tearing out of her throat. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at her hands, stripped of their rings, stripped of their power. The trust fund, the acquisition, I thought I could move the capital and replace it before the quarterly audit. It was arrogance. I thought I could control the timeline. "It was desperation," I corrected her softly. "You were trying to save the subsidiary. You were trying to save 3,000 jobs. I was trying to play God, she snapped, turning her head to face me. Her eyes were wet, shimmering in the low light, wide with a fear I had never seen her permit herself to feel. And because of my arrogance, you are the one sitting in the wreckage. Do you know what that feels like? To sit in that office for 3 weeks, safe, untouchable, while I watch security march you out? It felt like dying, Sophie. Every day of silence felt like a new betrayal. I didn't feel relief. I felt like a coward. A shock went through me, physical and sharp. I had assumed she was relieved. I had assumed she was managing the crisis with her usual cold efficiency, grateful that the problem had been excised. But she hadn't been managing anything. She had been bleeding out, just invisibly. I thought you wanted the distance, I admitted, my voice dropping to a whisper. I thought you needed the lie to be perfect. I stayed away to protect you. I didn't need protection, she said. And the air in the room suddenly shifted. It grew heavier, thicker, charged with a static that made the hair on my arm stand up. She leaned forward slightly, invading the neutral space between us on the sofa. I needed you. The confession hung in the air, changing the molecular structure of the room. It wasn't a CEO speaking to a subordinate. It wasn't a beneficiary speaking to a victim. It was a woman speaking to the only person who had ever seen her sin and chosen to stay. The tension shifted from professional fallout to something far more volatile. The space between us on the sofa suddenly didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a magnetic field, pulling us toward a collision we had been avoiding for 3 years. The silence that followed her admission wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the sudden, terrifying intimacy of being needed. Julianne didn't pull back. She didn't retreat into the safety of her title or the architecture of her authority. She stayed right there, on the edge of the velvet cushion, her gaze locked on mine with a desperation that was almost violent. I can't do it, Sophie, she said, her voice rough, barely above a whisper. I went back to the office the day after you left. I sat at that desk, and it felt like the cockpit of a plane in a tailspin. The new assistant, she's competent, she's fine, but she doesn't know the rhythm. She asks me where files are. She schedules meetings with people I'm trying to avoid. She doesn't know that I need 10 minutes of silence before the quarterly earnings call. She doesn't know me. She reached for her wine glass, her fingers tightening around the stem until her knuckles turned white. You didn't just manage my calendar. You managed my mind. You filtered the noise so I could hear the signal. Without you, it's just noise. All of it. The trust, the acquisition, the board, it's all just noise, and I am drowning in it. I watched her, feeling a dangerous pull in my chest. This was the Julianne I had protected, the brilliant, fragile engine behind the corporate machine. I can't come back, I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. We both know that. The board would revolt. My name is poison in that building. I don't want you in the building, she countered instantly, leaning closer. The scent of her, cedar and expensive perfume, drifted across the small distance between us. I don't want you on the payroll. I don't want you answering to HR or following a handbook you wrote. She set the glass down with a sharp click. I want you here. The words hung in the air, ambiguous and charged. I looked around the library. The walls of books, the dying fire, the shadows stretching across the floor. Here? The company is public, she said, her eyes darkening. But the trust behind it, the family assets, the private investments, the real power that keeps the board in check, that is private. It's a mess, Sophie. It's a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts that I haven't had time to organize in 5 years. That's where the vulnerability is. That's where I almost lost everything. She paused, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. I want you to manage the private estate. No board oversight, no compliance officers, just you and me, fixing the foundation so the house doesn't fall. I sat back, the velvet of the sofa crushing beneath my fingers. She wasn't offering me a job. She was offering me a partnership. She was inviting me into the inner sanctum, the unregulated chaos of her personal empire. It was a role with no title, no protection, and no exit strategy. If I took this, I wouldn't just be her employee. I would be her secret. You're asking me to be a ghost, I said softly. I'm asking you to be a partner, she corrected. I'm asking you to be the only person in the world who knows the truth. The risk was staggering. I analyzed it with the cold precision she valued in me. Professionally, it was suicide. I would be working in the shadows, invisible to the industry. But personally, it was the only thing I had wanted for 3 years. To be let in. To be essential. The negotiation shifted then. It stopped being about logistics and started being about the air between us. She leaned in, her arm resting on the back of the sofa, her fingers inches from my shoulder. I could feel the heat radiating from her body. The fire popped in the grate, a sharp sound that made us both flinch, but neither of us looked away. Her eyes searched mine, stripping away the layers of deference I had worn for so long. There was a hunger there, not just for my competence, but for my presence. She wanted me in her space. She wanted my coat in her foyer and my handwriting on her desk. I took a breath, tasting the oak and wine in the air. If I do this, I said, my voice dropping to match the intimacy of the room, the dynamic changes. No more hiding files, no more protecting me from the ugly parts. If I'm cleaning up the mess, I need to see all of it, every account, every secret, every mistake. I held her gaze, unflinching. I won't be your shield anymore, Julianne. I'll be your equal. Or I walk out that door right now. She didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. The corner of her mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile, a look of relief, of surrender, of terrifying gratitude. She reached out, her hand hovering in the space between us, palm open. It wasn't a handshake. It was an offering. No more secrets, she whispered. I promise. I looked at her hand, then up at her face. The deal was sealed in the silence, in the heavy electric pull that tethered us together in the dim light. I didn't take her hand. Instead, I picked up my wine glass and raised it slightly. She mirrored the gesture. The crystal chimed, a clear, resonant sound that marked the end of the lie and the beginning of something far more dangerous. The library became our entire world, a capsule sealed off from the city by heavy velvet drapes and the constant, rhythmic drumming of autumn rain against the glass. We established a routine that existed outside the laws of corporate time. I would arrive at 7, just as the streetlights on the Upper East Side were flickering to life, and the door would lock behind me, shutting out the reality of my unemployment and the scandal that was still whispering through the industry. Inside, time bent. We weren't boss and employee anymore. We were co-conspirators in a quiet, high-stakes archaeology of her life. The work was messy, tangible, and profoundly intimate. We weren't dealing with digital spreadsheets or sanitized board reports. We were dealing with paper, decades of it. We spread documents across the Persian rug, trust deeds from the 90s, handwritten letters from her grandfather, shell company ledgers that smelled of mildew and secrets. I was untangling the knot of her family's legacy, seeing the vulnerabilities she had hidden from the world. I saw where she had covered her father's debts. I saw the loans she had taken to keep the subsidiary afloat. To know someone's financial fear is a specific, naked kind of intimacy. I held the paper trails of her panic in my hands, and she let me. As the weeks bled into a month, the professional architecture we had maintained for years began to dissolve. The strict dress code of the office vanished. Julianne stopped wearing the armor of her tailored suits. She would greet me in cashmere joggers and oversized silk shirts, her feet bare, her hair pulled into a loose, messy knot that defied the gravity of her public persona. We ordered dinner in, Thai food or sushi, and ate it sitting on the floor, surrounded by millions of dollars in assets spread out on paper. There was something illicit about seeing the CEO of Apex Corp eating pad thai from a carton, laughing softly at a dry comment I made about tax loopholes. The guards were down, and the woman beneath them was softer, funnier, and infinitely more dangerous to my heart. We moved around each other with a fluidity that bordered on telepathy. I didn't need to ask her what she needed. I knew. I would hand her a specific file before she could articulate the request. She would pour me a glass of water the moment my throat went dry. We finished each other's sentences, not interrupting, but weaving two streams of thought into a single coherent strategy. It was a dance of minds, a cerebral seduction that felt more potent than any physical touch. We were building a new foundation for her empire, and in the process, we were mapping the contours of each other's intellects with a terrifying precision. But the physical world insisted on intruding. The library was large, yet we always seemed to gravitate toward the same small circle of lamplight. We would stand side by side at the drafting table, reviewing complex restructuring plans, and the proximity became a physical weight. I would feel the heat radiating from her arm, inches from mine. I would smell the cedar and jasmine of her skin, a scent that clouded my focus. Once, while pointing out a discrepancy in a ledger, her shoulder brushed against mine. Neither of us pulled away. We froze, the contact burning through the layers of silk and cotton, the air in the room suddenly charged with a static that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The tension wasn't spoken. It was atmospheric. It lived in the long pauses between words, in the way her eyes would linger on my hands as I sorted papers, in the way I would catch myself watching the pulse at her throat. We were circling the drain of something inevitable, pretending that the work was the only thing keeping us in that room until 2 a.m. We were lying to ourselves, but the lies were becoming harder to sustain with every rainy night that locked us together in that dim, cedar-scented sanctuary. Then came a Tuesday where the work was done, the files were stacked, and the clock read past midnight. Yet neither of us moved to end the night. The silence that settled over the library wasn't the quiet of completion. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a question waiting to be asked. The rain had turned into a deluge, hammering against the brownstone like a demand, mirroring the pressure building inside the room. I looked at her, standing by the fire, and I knew we had reached the edge of the map. The work was over. The real danger was just beginning. The storm outside had evolved from a steady rhythm into a siege. The wind rattled the heavy window panes in their frames, a violent contrast to the hushed, velvet stillness of the library. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, before dying completely. The room plunged into a sudden, heavy darkness, relieved only by the orange glow of the fireplace. Shadows stretched long and dancing across the walls, transforming the familiar stacks of books into a cavern of secrets. Julianne didn't move to find a flashlight. She sat in the wingback chair near the hearth, a book resting open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. The firelight caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone and the softness of her throat, painting her in strokes of amber and deep shadow. I stood by the drafting table, trapped in the act of watching her. It was a dangerous indulgence. In the office, I had trained myself to look at her with a professional filter, noticing the crease in a blazer that meant stress, the tapping of a pen that meant impatience. But here, in the dark, the filter dissolved. I wasn't looking at my boss. I was looking at the woman who had become the center of gravity in my life, admiring the unguarded softness of her mouth when she thought no one was analyzing her. "You're staring," she said. Her voice was low, barely rising above the crackle of the logs, but it cut through the room with absolute clarity. She didn't look up from the unread page. "I'm thinking," I lied, though the flush rising on my neck betrayed me in the gloom. "You're lying." She finally closed the book, the sound of the cover snapping shut echoing like a gunshot in the quiet. She turned her head, and her eyes found mine in the darkness, unflinching, reflective, stripping away the excuse. "We finished the trust restructuring 3 hours ago, Sophie. There is nothing left to think about. Unless we are talking about the things we haven't said, for a month." The air in the room thickened, charged with a sudden, suffocating honesty. She shifted in the chair, turning her body fully toward me. "You lost everything," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a brutal calm. "Your license, your reputation, your income. You sit in this house every night rebuilding my life, but you haven't said a word about the wreckage of your own." "It was necessary," I said, my voice tight. "Was it?" She stood up then. The movement was fluid, deliberate. "You told me you did it to save the company. But I've watched you, Sophie. I've watched you organize my father's debts with a tenderness that has nothing to do with corporate strategy. I've watched you anticipate my thoughts before I even form them." She took a step toward me. The space between us was shrinking, the safety of the room evaporating. "Tell me the truth. Why did you really take the fall? What did you lose that was worth saving me?" My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the storm. The defense mechanisms I had built, the professionalism, the logic, the duty, crumbled under the weight of her proximity. I couldn't hide behind the job anymore, because the job didn't exist. "I didn't do it for the company," I whispered. The confession felt like a physical release, a breaking of a dam that had held back 3 years of silence. I didn't care about the legacy. I didn't care about the board or the stock price. I couldn't watch you break. I couldn't watch the world tear you apart. The career, it was just noise. Losing it was the price of keeping you whole. That was the only math that mattered. The silence that followed was deafening. Julianne stopped moving. She stood 5 feet away, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. But her breathing had changed, shallow, uneven. The confession hung there, naked and irrevocable. I had admitted that the sacrifice was personal. I had admitted that she was the priority. Then she moved. It wasn't the brisk, efficient stride of the CEO. It was a slow, predatory prowl. She closed the remaining distance between us with a terrifying intent. The air around her seemed to warp, radiating heat and the scent of cedar and rain. She didn't stop until she was inches away, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. She didn't touch me. She just stood there, occupying my space, her presence overwhelming my senses. The tension was a physical weight, pressing against my chest, demanding an answer that words could no longer provide. The library walls seemed to close in, forcing us into this singular, inevitable collision. The distance between us had vanished, consumed by a gravity that felt older than the company, older than the lies we had told to protect it. The air in the library was no longer just air. It was a physical medium, thick with the scent of cedar, rain, and the terrifying anticipation of a line being crossed. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a warmth that seemed to seep through the silk of her blouse and settle into my own skin. She didn't speak. The time for negotiation was over. The boardroom tactics, the strategic silence, the careful maneuvering, it all dissolved in the flickering orange light of the dying fire. Her hand moved first. It was slow, hesitant in a way Julianne never was. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and traced the line of my jaw. Her skin was cool against the flush of my cheek, a shocking contrast that sent a shiver straight down my spine. She wasn't touching me like a boss touches an employee, or even a friend. She was touching me like a blind woman, learning the shape of something precious she had been afraid to hold. Her thumb brushed the corner of my mouth, a silent question that demanded a physical answer. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I leaned into her touch, surrendering the last shred of my professional armor. "Julianne," I breathed, the name feeling heavy and new on my tongue in this context. She didn't let me finish. She leaned in, closing the final inch, and pressed her lips to mine. It wasn't the frantic, desperate collision of two people trying to escape a crisis. It was slow, deliberate, unflinching. It tasted of the vintage wine we had been nursing, dark and complex, and of the weeks of silence we had endured. It was a kiss heavy with the weight of every unsaid word, every stolen glance across a conference table, every moment I had stood behind her chair and wanted to be standing beside her. Her hands moved into my hair, tangling in the strands, pulling me closer until there was no space left for secrets. I felt the tension leave her body, melting away as if the contact was the only thing that could ground her. The CEO was gone. The strategist was gone. There was only this, the softness of her lips, the uneven rhythm of her breathing against my cheek, the terrifying reality of being wanted by the woman I had worshipped from the shadows. My hands found her waist, gripping the soft cashmere of her sweater, anchoring us both in the center of the storm. The sensation was overwhelming. The friction of fabric, the scent of her perfume amplifying in the heat of the moment, the sound of the rain battering the glass like applause for our rebellion. We broke apart slowly, neither of us willing to let the distance return. She rested her forehead against mine, her eyes closed, her breathing ragged. The library was silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of us. "I can't go back," she whispered, her voice raw. "I can't go back to the way it was before you came here." "We aren't going back," I said, my voice steady in the dark. "We're building something else." We stayed there as the fire died down to embers, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the library. The power dynamic that had defined our lives for 3 years had flipped. I wasn't the secretary taking orders. She wasn't the executive giving them. We were equals in this vulnerability, stripped of titles and pretenses, bound together not by a contract, but by the truth we had finally allowed into the room. I realized then that the blacklisting, the shame, the walk out of the building, it had all been a shedding of skin. I had to lose the job to find the woman. The morning light broke through the heavy drapes hours later, gray and pale, washing out the shadows of the night. It brought clarity, sharp and absolute. I watched the dust motes dance in the shaft of light, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing beside me. There was no regret in the cold light of day. There was only the realization that the world had shifted on its axis, and for the first time, I was standing on solid ground. We stood in the kitchen the next morning, the smell of coffee replacing the scent of wine. She handed me a mug, her fingers brushing mine with a casual, possessive familiarity. The career I had burned was the price of admission to this life, and looking at her now, unguarded, real, mine, I knew I had won the better deal. If you understand the weight of silence, subscribe for more stories from the shadows. Tell me in the comments, what would you sacrifice for the one person who truly sees you?